In a single year, Kevin Costner watched three pillars of his life collapse almost simultaneously. The role that had resurrected his career vanished from beneath his feet. Tens of millions of dollars he had invested with absolute conviction suddenly looked like a gamble the world believed had failed. And the marriage he had spent nearly 2 decades building quietly came to an end. For most men, one of those losses would have been enough to break them. For Kevin Costner, it was simply another chapter in a life defined by impossible bets. Hollywood has always had a complicated relationship with men like him. The industry loves to crown them when their vision succeeds, when their courage creates something extraordinary. But it loves even more to watch when that same courage appears to push them too far. When the ambition that once made them heroes begins to look like arrogance. When the risks that once created legends suddenly start to resemble mistakes. Kevin Costner knew this pattern better than most. He had lived it before. He was the man who once stood at the center of American cinema, holding 2 Academy Awards in his hands after directing and starring in a film every studio had quietly warned him not to make. A film that was too long, too slow, too unconventional to succeed. And yet it did. It conquered Hollywood and turned him into one of the most powerful figures in the industry. But he was also the same man who would later become the center of one of Hollywood's most infamous production disasters. The man mocked by headlines, questioned by critics, and written off by an industry that had once celebrated him. And still, decades later, when most actors his age had already faded into quiet nostalgia, Kevin Costner returned again. At 65 years old, he became the most watched actor on American television, commanding millions of viewers every week from a ranch in Montana. To the public, it looked like a remarkable comeback. But what the spotlight never revealed was the price behind every one of those victories. The years spent chasing stories no one else believed in. The private silences building at home while the world applauded his success. The relationships that quietly fractured while he was busy building legends on screen. And perhaps the most difficult truth of all, the same relentless conviction that made Kevin Costner extraordinary may also have been the force that cost him everything more than once. So how does a boy who never quite felt like he belonged anywhere grow up to become one of the defining faces of American cinema? What really happened during the chaos of Waterworld, the film that nearly destroyed his reputation? Why did 2 marriages collapse at the exact moments his career reached its highest peaks? And what drives a man, even after decades of fame, success, and painful loss, to risk tens of millions of his own money on one final story the industry still calls madness? To understand any of that, we have to go back to the very beginning. Back to a quiet boy in Southern California who spent most of his childhood learning how to enter a room without ever truly feeling like he belonged inside it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to children who grow up constantly starting over. Is the loneliness of always being the new kid. New classroom, new streets, new faces already arranged into friendships that existed long before you arrived. Kevin Michael Costner was born on January 18th, 1955, in Linwood, California, the youngest of 3 boys born to Sharon Ray and William Costner. On the surface, his childhood looked ordinary. His father worked as a utility executive for Southern California Edison, a practical man who believed deeply in discipline, responsibility, and the quiet dignity of hard work. His mother was warm and nurturing, but raising 3 boys in a constantly moving household left little room for stillness. Because the Costner family moved frequently. Compton, Delano, Visalia, Villa Park. Every few years meant a new school, a new set of social rules, and the same silent challenge waiting for him each time he walked through the classroom door. Kevin later described those years with a quiet honesty that revealed more than nostalgia ever could. I was always the new kid. For many children, that experience can be isolating. For Kevin, it became a kind of training ground. When you're always the outsider entering someone else's world, you learn something quickly. You learn to observe. You watch how people talk, how they move, how they laugh. You study the invisible hierarchy of a room before you ever try to belong to it. Without realizing it, Kevin Costner was developing one of the most essential instincts an actor could ever possess. He was learning how to read people. But as a boy, it didn't feel like preparation for a future career. It simply felt like loneliness dressed up as adaptability. What helped him survive those restless years were two unlikely companions: water and stories. Kevin fell in love with swimming early in his life. The discipline of the sport gave him structure in an environment that constantly changed. For a time, competitive swimming even looked like it might become his path forward. But there was another world that held his imagination more deeply. Stories. Kevin devoured books. He lost himself in films. And as a teenager, he began writing poetry privately, small reflections and emotions he was not yet ready to speak aloud. In church, he sang in the choir, discovering the strange, powerful feeling of performing in front of others. The act of stepping into a shared emotional moment with strangers, projecting something internal into a room full of people. He didn't know it yet, but these were the early building blocks of the life he would eventually lead. Still, the path ahead of him was far from obvious. His father believed firmly in practical careers, the kind of work that provided stability and security. Acting, with its uncertain promises and brutal odds, did not fit easily into that worldview. So when Kevin enrolled at California State University, Fullerton, he chose a safer direction: business administration. It was a sensible decision, a responsible one, the kind of path that made sense to a young man raised in a household where hard work mattered more than dreams. But something inside him refused to stay quiet. During his college years, Kevin began quietly exploring acting on the side. He attended small workshops, took classes, and participated in local theater productions whenever he could. At first, it felt like an experiment, a question he needed to answer for himself. But the answer became impossible to ignore. Acting wasn't a hobby. It was the one thing in his life that ignited a kind of energy nothing else could match. By the time he graduated in 1978, Kevin Costner made a decision that terrified him almost as much as it inspired him. He was going to pursue acting seriously, not as a backup plan, not as a side interest, as everything. That decision came with another major step in his life. In the same year he graduated, Kevin married Cindy Silva, his college sweetheart. She had seen him before any fame, before any recognition, before Hollywood had any idea who he was. Together they stepped into a future that, at the time, looked anything but glamorous. Because chasing an acting career in Hollywood rarely begins with applause. It usually begins with survival. And Kevin Costner was about to spend the next several years learning exactly how difficult survival could be. The early years of Kevin Costner's acting career did not look anything like the legend that would eventually surround his name. There were no red carpets, no studio meetings, no sudden moment when Hollywood discovered him and everything changed overnight. There was only work, the kind of work that had nothing to do with acting. After graduating from college in 1978 and committing to the idea that he would pursue acting seriously, Kevin and his wife Cindy stepped into a life defined almost entirely by uncertainty. Hollywood was a difficult place for newcomers even in the best of circumstances, and Kevin arrived without connections, without reputation, and without any guarantee that his gamble would pay off. So he did what he had been taught his entire life to do. He worked. Kevin took whatever jobs he could find to support his young family. He drove trucks. He worked as a stagehand. At one point, he even labored at a fish hatchery, spending long hours doing physically demanding work that had little to do with the dream he carried quietly in his mind. But every spare moment was dedicated to auditions. He showed up to casting calls with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through years of being the new kid in unfamiliar schools. Rejection became a routine part of his life. One audition would end, another would begin, and the answer was almost always the same. No, Hollywood in those years did not see Kevin Costner. At least not yet. He managed to land a few small roles, brief appearances in films that passed through theaters without leaving much of an impression. Casting directors often described him the same way: good, reliable, but not memorable. For a young actor trying to break through, that description could be more dangerous than outright rejection. Being overlooked quietly meant the industry could continue moving forward without ever truly noticing you. And for a while, that is exactly what happened. Then came a moment that nearly ended everything before it had even begun. In 1983, Kevin was cast in a small but meaningful role in a film directed by Lawrence Kasdan called The Big Chill. The movie followed a group of former college friends reuniting after the death of one of their own. Kevin's role was the deceased friend, appearing in several flashback scenes that were meant to anchor the emotional core of the story. For Kevin, it felt like a breakthrough. He prepared carefully. He treated the role with the seriousness of someone who knew opportunities like this didn't come often. But when the film was finally released, something shocking had happened. His scenes were gone, completely removed during editing. Kevin Costner had spent weeks working on the film, believing it might finally open the door he had been chasing for years. In the finished version, the only trace of his presence was a brief shot of a body lying in a coffin. His legs were visible. That was it. For many actors, that moment would have felt like a final verdict. Years of struggle, erased in the editing room before audiences ever had the chance to see what you could do. But something unexpected happened next. Lawrence Kasdan felt terrible about the decision. He understood how much it must have hurt, and he also recognized something in Kevin that had impressed him during filming. So he reached out. He promised that the next time he had the right role, Kevin would get another opportunity. That opportunity arrived 2 years later. In 1985, Kasdan cast him in a Western called Silverado. Unlike the brief, nearly invisible role in The Big Chill, this time Kevin Costner was given space to perform. The film featured an impressive ensemble cast that included Danny Glover, Scott Glenn, Jeff Goldblum, and Kevin Kline. Surrounded by established actors, Kevin stepped into the role of Jake, a charming and reckless gunslinger. And for the first time, audiences noticed him. He carried an energy on screen that felt both natural and dangerous at the same time. He wasn't stiff or overly calculated. His performances felt relaxed, confident, almost effortless. Hollywood began to look at him differently. What followed was not a slow, careful rise. It was something closer to an explosion. In 1987, Kevin Costner starred in The Untouchables, playing federal agent Elliot Ness opposite two giants of cinema, Sean Connery and Robert De Niro. Many younger actors might have struggled to hold their ground beside performers of that caliber. Kevin didn't. He anchored the film with a quiet moral conviction that made his character believable and compelling. The industry took notice. Then, just 1 year later, came the film that changed everything. Bull Durham. Released in 1988, the movie was a romantic comedy set in the world of minor league baseball. It wasn't a massive blockbuster production, but it carried something more valuable than scale. It had heart. Kevin played Crash Davis, a veteran catcher nearing the end of his baseball career, a man who understood the beauty and absurdity of chasing dreams that might never fully come true. The performance felt so natural that it barely seemed like acting. Audiences loved him. Suddenly, the actor who had once been considered fine but not memorable became one of the most sought-after leading men in Hollywood. Scripts began arriving in piles. Directors wanted him. Producers trusted him. And just when it seemed like his career had already reached an incredible height, another film arrived that would define him forever. Field of Dreams. Released in 1989, it told the story of a farmer who hears a mysterious voice telling him to build a baseball field in the middle of his cornfield. It sounds ridiculous, but Kevin Costner made audiences believe it. He portrayed the character with such sincerity, such quiet conviction, that the film became something more than entertainment. It became a cultural touchstone. The lines spoken in the film would echo through American cinema for decades. If you build it, he will come. By the end of the 1980s, Kevin Costner had achieved something extraordinary. In just a few years, he had transformed from an overlooked actor struggling to find work into one of the most powerful leading men in Hollywood. But the most ambitious gamble of his entire life was still waiting. And it would arrive in 1990 with a film that almost no one in the industry believed would succeed. By the end of the 1980s, Kevin Costner had already accomplished what many actors spend their entire careers chasing. He was a bankable star. Films like Bull Durham and Field of Dreams had turned him into something rare in Hollywood. He was not the explosive action hero dominating the box office at the time. He was not larger than life in the way Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone were. Kevin Costner represented something different. He was the ordinary man who believed in extraordinary things. Audiences trusted him. When he stood on screen and spoke about hope, faith, or conviction, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like sincerity. That authenticity was about to lead him toward the most dangerous gamble of his career. In 1990, Kevin Costner decided to do something Hollywood had quietly warned him against. He would direct his own film. The project was an epic Western called Dances with Wolves. The story followed a Union soldier during the American Civil War who slowly forms a bond with the Lakota Sioux tribe and begins to question the world he once believed in. On paper, it sounded like a commercial disaster. The film was nearly 3 hours long. Westerns were widely considered outdated and unprofitable by that point in Hollywood history. Large portions of the dialogue were spoken in the Lakota language, something studios believed audiences would never accept. Several industry executives advised Costner not to do it. But Kevin Costner had never been particularly good at ignoring the stories he believed in. Instead of walking away, he leaned further into the risk. He invested his own reputation into the project. He stepped behind the camera as director while also carrying the film as its leading actor. It was an enormous responsibility. Filming took place across the wide landscapes of South Dakota, where Costner spent months managing every aspect of the production: directing, acting, coordinating logistics, solving problems on set, and pushing forward a vision that many people believed would collapse under its own ambition. When Dances with Wolves was finally released in 1990, something remarkable happened. Audiences embraced it. The film was powerful, emotional, and visually stunning. Instead of rejecting the slower pace and cultural depth of the story, viewers connected deeply with its themes of humanity, respect, and transformation. At the 63rd Academy Awards, the film won 7 Oscars: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Adapted Screenplay. Kevin Costner stood on stage that night holding the Academy Award for Best Director at just 35 years old. In a single moment, he had transformed from a respected actor into one of the most powerful figures in the entire film industry. Hollywood now treated him differently. He was no longer simply another leading man. He was a filmmaker with vision, someone capable of turning risky ideas into cultural phenomena. And the success didn't stop there. 2 years later, in 1992, Costner starred in The Bodyguard alongside Whitney Houston. The film became a global box office sensation. Its soundtrack, featuring Houston's iconic performance of I Will Always Love You, became one of the best-selling albums in music history. Kevin Costner was no longer just a Hollywood star. He was a global phenomenon. Studios trusted his instincts. Directors wanted to work with him. His name alone was powerful enough to launch massive productions. At the height of his fame, he was earning around $15 million per film, an extraordinary amount at the time. To the outside world, Kevin Costner appeared unstoppable. But what the cameras rarely showed was the cost accumulating behind the scenes. The same obsessive dedication that allowed him to create something like Dances with Wolves required an enormous amount of time, focus, and emotional energy. On that production alone, Costner had spent months living far away from home, fully immersed in the world of the film. While he was building a cinematic legacy, his family life was quietly beginning to feel the absence. His wife Cindy had been there from the very beginning. She had supported him through years of struggle, through every rejection, through the uncertain period when his acting career looked like it might never take off. Together, they had built a life and raised 3 children. But as Kevin Costner's career expanded into something enormous, the distance between his professional world and his private life began to grow. Years later, Costner would look back on that period with painful honesty. I wasn't as present as I should have been. At the time, however, none of those cracks were visible to the public. The world saw only the success. Oscars on the shelf, blockbusters in theaters. A career that seemed to be climbing higher every year. Standing at the very summit of Hollywood power, Kevin Costner made another decision that would change everything. Instead of choosing a safe project that would preserve his reputation, he decided to attempt something even larger than Dances with Wolves. And in doing so, he set in motion one of the most infamous production stories in Hollywood history. By the early 1990s, Kevin Costner possessed something almost no actor in Hollywood history had ever fully achieved: unconditional trust. Studios approved projects because his name was attached. Producers competed for his attention. His salary had climbed to nearly $15 million per film, and audiences around the world associated him with prestige, success, and emotional storytelling. He could have protected that position easily. Many actors in his place chose safe roles, predictable scripts, and carefully managed careers designed to preserve their popularity for as long as possible. Kevin Costner did the opposite. In 1993, he committed himself to a project that immediately raised eyebrows across Hollywood. The film was called Waterworld, a massive science fiction epic set in a future where the polar ice caps had melted and the entire planet had been submerged beneath endless oceans. The story followed a mysterious drifter known only as the Mariner, a solitary figure navigating a brutal water-covered world where survivors lived on floating structures and fought for the smallest pieces of land. It was a visually ambitious concept, but the scale of the production was unprecedented. The film required enormous floating sets constructed directly in the open ocean near Hawaii. Entire artificial structures had to be built and anchored at sea. Massive equipment, cameras, and crews operated under unpredictable weather conditions while battling powerful currents and storms. Almost immediately, the production began to spiral out of control. Storms repeatedly damaged the floating set. Expensive equipment sank into the ocean. Filming schedules collapsed under the unpredictable conditions of the Pacific. Every delay meant additional costs, and the budget began to climb rapidly. First, it rose to $130 million, then $150 million. Eventually, it reached nearly $175 million, making Waterworld the most expensive film ever produced at that time. The press quickly seized on the story. What had begun as an ambitious production turned into a media spectacle. Entertainment magazines and trade publications ran constant updates about the growing budget and the chaos on set. Late-night comedians turned Costner into a punchline, mocking the film as a symbol of Hollywood excess. Nicknames began to circulate within the industry. Kevin's Gate, Fish Star, cruel comparisons to previous box office disasters that had damaged careers. Behind the scenes, tensions between Costner and director Kevin Reynolds reportedly intensified as the pressure mounted. Creative disagreements emerged over the direction of the film, and eventually Reynolds left the project before post-production was completed. Costner found himself carrying the weight of the film almost entirely on his own. When Waterworld was finally released in 1995, critics did not deliver the explosive condemnation many had predicted. But the reaction was far from enthusiastic. Reviews described the film as ambitious yet flawed, visually impressive but emotionally uneven. At the global box office, the movie performed better than expected and eventually recovered much of its enormous cost through international markets and home video sales. But by that point, the narrative surrounding the film had already been decided. In the eyes of the media and much of Hollywood, Waterworld had become a symbol of ambition gone too far. The industry that had celebrated Kevin Costner only a few years earlier now treated him as a cautionary tale, the example of what happens when success convinces someone they can do anything. The king of Hollywood had stumbled, and the fall was not finished yet. Because while his reputation was being challenged in public, something far more painful was quietly collapsing behind the scenes of his private life. Professional humiliation is difficult for anyone to endure. But for Kevin Costner, the deeper damage during the mid-1990s did not come from critics, headlines, or box office numbers. It came from home. Long before Waterworld became a symbol of Hollywood excess, The foundations of his personal life had already begun to shift in ways the public could not see. Kevin's marriage to Cindy Silva had started in the most ordinary and sincere way possible. They met as students at California State University, Fullerton, two young people building a future before either of them had fame, wealth, or recognition. Cindy had married a man who was still chasing something uncertain. She had stood beside him through years of obscurity, through the long days when Kevin worked physical jobs to pay the bills while attending auditions that rarely led anywhere, through the disappointment of roles that disappeared before audiences could even notice them. When Kevin's career finally exploded in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it seemed like the reward for everything they had endured together. But success at that scale carries its own consequences. The same relentless focus that allowed Kevin Costner to create films like Dances with Wolves demanded enormous time and attention. Directing, producing, and starring in ambitious projects meant months spent away from home. Every production became a world of its own, requiring total commitment from the man leading it. Slowly, that commitment began to reshape the life he had built with Cindy. Fame also changes the architecture of relationships. A household that once revolved around family routines suddenly becomes surrounded by managers, lawyers, producers, and publicists. Time disappears into meetings, travel, interviews, and endless professional obligations. The distance between Kevin's public life and his private one continued to grow. By the early 1990s, the strain had become impossible to ignore. In 1994, after 16 years of marriage and 3 children together, Cindy Silva filed for divorce. The separation shocked many observers who had seen the couple as a stable presence in an industry known for instability. The divorce settlement was enormous for its time. Reports estimated it at nearly $80 million, one of the largest celebrity divorce settlements Hollywood had ever seen. The financial impact was significant, but for Costner, the emotional cost carried far greater weight. Years later, he would speak about that period with a rare and uncomfortable honesty. I was not the husband I should have been. There was no attempt to shift responsibility or soften the truth. Only the quiet recognition that the same ambition that had built his extraordinary career had also taken something irreplaceable from him. What made the moment particularly brutal was its timing. The collapse of his marriage happened at almost the exact same moment his professional reputation was being challenged by the controversy surrounding Waterworld. Public scrutiny intensified as tabloids dissected both stories at once, treating his personal life and his career difficulties as parallel forms of entertainment. Costner endured the attention without public anger or dramatic outbursts. Those who knew him during that time described a man who had grown noticeably quieter, not defeated, but changed. The effortless confidence that had defined his early years in Hollywood had been replaced with something more careful and reflective. A man who understood that success could disappear quickly and that the things lost along the way could not always be rebuilt. Yet Kevin Costner did not disappear. He continued working, appearing in films throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, slowly rebuilding both his career and his personal life. What no one realized at the time was that his story was far from finished. Because decades later, when most of Hollywood believed his greatest years were already behind him, Kevin Costner would return in a way almost no one expected. Hollywood has a quiet way of moving on from people. It rarely happens in a dramatic moment. There is no announcement, no final farewell. The calls simply come less often. The roles become smaller. New faces rise while older names slowly fade into the background of an industry that is always chasing the next sensation. By the early 2000s, many believed Kevin Costner had reached that stage of his career. The films continued. Projects like Open Range, The Upside of Anger, and Mr. Brooks demonstrated that his skill as an actor had not disappeared. In fact, some critics argued that the hardships of the previous decade had deepened his performances. The confidence of his early years had evolved into something more layered and reflective. But the cultural spotlight had shifted elsewhere. To many audiences, Kevin Costner had become a symbol of an earlier era of Hollywood, a star associated with the emotional dramas and sweeping epics of the late 20th century. His work remained respected, but it no longer dominated the public conversation. Costner himself did not seem interested in chasing that attention. He invested time in music, performing with his band Kevin Costner and Modern West. He focused on his children and on the quiet rhythms of life at his ranch. The pace of his world slowed, shaped less by the machinery of Hollywood and more by the ordinary presence of family and personal passions. And then, unexpectedly, another opportunity arrived. In 2018, writer and director Taylor Sheridan approached Costner with a role in a new television series called Yellowstone. The story centered on a powerful ranching family in Montana struggling to protect their land against developers, politicians, and a rapidly changing America. Costner would play John Dutton, the aging patriarch of the Dutton family. The character was complex, proud, and deeply flawed. A man who carried the burden of protecting something larger than himself while constantly navigating moral compromises and personal sacrifices. Costner immediately recognized something familiar in the role. John Dutton was not simply another character. He reflected the themes that had defined Costner's entire career: loyalty, land, legacy, and the quiet determination of individuals who refuse to surrender what they believe matters most. When Yellowstone premiered, its success built gradually. But by its third and fourth seasons, the show had become the most watched series on American cable television. Millions of viewers tuned in each week, drawn to its sweeping landscapes and morally complex storytelling. At 65 years old, Kevin Costner had become the central figure of one of the biggest television phenomena in the country. It was a remarkable resurgence. The actor many had quietly filed away as a star of the past was suddenly leading the present. Yet the deeper meaning of Kevin Costner's story does not lie in awards, ratings, or box office records. Those achievements rise and fall with the changing tastes of an industry that rarely stands still. What endures is something far simpler. Throughout his life, Kevin Costner repeatedly chose the difficult path. He pursued stories others believed would fail. He invested his own money in projects few people fully understood. He accepted public criticism and personal loss without abandoning the convictions that shaped his work. Some of those risks succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Others failed painfully and very publicly. But through every rise, every fall, and every unexpected return, one truth remained constant. Kevin Costner never stopped building. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a life lived with conviction. Not that every gamble paid off, but that even after losing everything more than once, he kept going.